Good evening and welcome back to another season of Zoom into Nature, the Land Conservancy's evening webinar series that covers a wide range of nature topics, from flying squirrels to lichen to Ohio's native orchids. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Jennifer Essler, who will deliver her presentation, Invasive Spotted Lanternflies, Progress and Potential of Canine Detectors. I am Renee Bronca, the Director of Conservation Education and Outreach at Western Reserve Land Conservancy. At the Land Conservancy, I develop virtual and in-person programming for people of all ages. I'm very fortunate to be able to host our field trips within the network of conservation properties the Land Conservancy has protected in Northeast Ohio, which totals over 75,000 acres of natural landscapes, family farms, and urban green spaces. Tonight, we'll learn more about spotted lanternflies and how dogs are being used to detect these invasive species. Over the last couple years, we've watched lanternflies slowly make their way into our region. In 2014, the very first spotted lanternfly was reported in the United States in Berks County, Pennsylvania, and each year they've moved closer to the Cleveland area. It was during a meeting of the Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership in 2021 that we learned that several populations had been found in and around Cleveland. Notably, these were discovered along railroad lines. Following last year's explosion of sightings, it seems we need to turn our attention to slowing down this invasive species that has the ability to cause a great deal of damage to our natural resources, especially our agricultural industry. As always, please remember to place your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and please don't use the chat feature for questions. We'll spend time at the end of the program covering as many questions as we can. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Essler. Dr. Essler graduated from Georgia State University in 2011 with a BA in psychology and received her master's in animal behavior from Bucknell University in 2013. At both universities, she worked with capuchin monkeys, investigating aspects of cooperation, decision-making, and inequity aversion. She received a PhD in comparative cognition at the University of Veterinary Medicine in Vienna, Austria. Here, she investigated how domestication affected inequity aversion and cooperation among hand-raised pack-living wolves as well as dogs. She was a postdoc fellow at the Penn Vet Working Dog Center in Philadelphia, where she investigated odor profiles of ovarian cancer, as well as the feasibility of using dogs to detect invasive species and COVID-19. She is currently an assistant professor at SUNY Cobleskill, where she teaches classes on animal behavior and canine detection. Her current research is on the potential use of detection dogs to find the invasive round goby. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hello.
Hi.
Nice to see all these people. Um,
We
I
have a
guess I'll sh
crowd. We do have a
yeah.
crowd tonight. Yes.
Yeah. I guess I can just share and and,
Yeah,
and
for
start.
sure. Sounds great.
Okay. Um, Let me know if that works. Does that work?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay. So I'm gonna keep my video on just because I think that it
Yeah,
makes it a little bit easier to kind of follow the speaker.
absolutely.
So yes, my name is Jennifer Essler. Most of the work I'll be talking about today was done at the Penn Vet Working Dog Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And I will apologize in advance. I have my dogs with me, and it's not out of the question that in the next hour or so they will bark. So if you see me like moving my hands, that's me bribing them to stop barking. Um, but yes, thank you everyone for coming. This is by far the largest amount of people I've ever spoken to, so I'm a little bit nervous, but we'll get through this. And I know there's potentially people in the chat that I'll be citing, so I apologize in advance if I miscite any word. Please correct me. So yeah, so today we'll be talking about spotted lanternflies and how we use dogs to detect them. So just to give a little overview of the presentation, I have a brief background on spotted lanternfly, where they're from, kind of a little bit of their invasive history in the US, a bit about the spotted lantern life cycle because it is important. We only use dogs to detect during a certain part of the life cycle. But the note, I am not an entomologist, so I cannot answer very specific questions about that species. A little bit on their impact and why their presence is a threat. Asked that a lot. Some background on conservation dogs, the original goals of our project, what we found in our study, and studies since, including some of the community science going on, and then some kind of final thoughts. So yeah. And like I said, Renee, feel free to stop me with any relevant questions at the time. It's totally fine.
You bet, I will. Thanks, Jennifer.
So a little bit of background on the spotted lanternfly, if you haven't seen them, if you've been lucky enough to not see them, I suppose. So they're a planthopper insect, native to China, India, and Vietnam, so pretty far from the US. Planthopper gets the name from this really interesting hopping movement they do. It's very similar to a grasshopper if you've ever seen it. And spotted lanternflies are actually a lot kind of bigger than I ever expected. When we first started working on the project, I didn't really have any concept of them, but the actual adults can get quite big. I was back in the Pennsylvania a few last semester, at the beginning of the semester, and one jumped on me, and you can feel it. They're pretty heavy. But they were first seen in the US, like Renee said, in Pennsylvania in 2014. I checked today before, they're still in, or they're at least in 18 states. So they have spread pretty readily across the US. When we started this project, it wasn't nearly as spread as it is now. Interestingly, they prefer to feed on the tree of heaven, which is also invasive. And if that were the only one they fed on, it might be different. But they feed kind of generally on everything, trees and other crops, and crops in particular are where it becomes a financial issue, especially in the US. But if you've ever had these in your area, they're prolific. They go on almost every single tree that they can, and they really overwhelm them. For the life cycle, and this is pretty important, I have a slide after this showing kind of the whole thing with pictures in case you've never seen them. They lay eggs in one season per year. It's like fall to late fall, typically by early November. And what you see on the right here is actually a picture I took the first season that they were in Philly, of a spotted lanternfly actually laying eggs. So they're bright white when they're first laid, and then they kind of look like mud afterwards. And inside of each of those egg masses, there's like 50 to 60 little eggs. They're really, really tiny. And typically these eggs are on trees, but they can be found on other substrates. So when we had them in Philly, they were mostly on trees, but really anything near trees. So we had a lot of trees, for example, near our rubble yard where you train the search and rescue dogs. And it has a lot of like wooden pallets out there. And underneath those wooden pallets, there were always a lot of these egg masses. And typically, if you're looking, they tend to put them on the underside of branches and pallets, presumably because it also protects them from like rain and elements. So if you are underneath a tree that has a lot of egg masses on it and look up underneath the branches, you'll see a lot of them under. So once they're laid, they have this covering that turns into mud-like. And they make them, they're pretty camouflaged. Like I said, when I was there in the spring, I had some other faculty from my university there, from my New York University there, who had never seen them. And I had to really point out quite closely where they are, just because they really don't look like much until you see them. Though I will say, having worked with them, I can never not see them now. And then what happens is these eggs overwinter. And so they stay on these trees or branches or whatever they're on until May, a little bit earlier than May, maybe April, and then they hatch. Sorry, my dog's barking, coughing, of course. And so this is one of the times when, hold on one second. This is one of the times when it was kind of hypothesized maybe to use dogs to keep them from moving, because this is one of the most common times they move out of like a quarantine zone. So sometimes people think it's like the actual adults leaving, but it's typically human transport of these egg masses. And so this is a graphic put out by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. And so you can see on the top right here, this was a picture that um, was taken very similar to what I took in Philly. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm like now I'm wondering like, does my dog have kennel cough?
They're
And I haven't
they're
noticed it.
they're part of the problem here. They're part of the program here
Right.
too.
Toby, the one barking, is a spotted lanternfly dog, so I feel like he's just like
Okay.
making his presence
That's
known.
right. Yeah.
So on the top right here, you have this white egg mass covering. And on the side here, these little tiny egg pieces, each of those is an egg. So you can imagine within that whole egg mass, there's like a whole bunch of eggs. And then you get these little tiny nymphs, and they are really, really tiny. So if you're working with these egg masses, when they start to hatch, so like in training, for example, they can get through a lot of holes. But mostly what you'll see over the winter is this bottom right one. And the two on the left are the adults. And it's kind of unfortunate because they are kind of a pretty species. They're very they're big and they're attractive, but invasive nonetheless. And I have a couple of pictures here. So there was a study done a couple of years ago, kind of looking at where in the US, and then on the next slide, where in the world is kind of the most suitable for spotted lanternflies in the US. And as you can see here, a lot of the US is very suitable for spotted lanternflies. When I was looking at you guys coming into the chat, and posting like where you were, a lot of you guys are in areas where these these guys could be. But low to high, that's a lot of the US. And of course, up here was where we started. And then when you look at the whole world, the US is a lot of it, some of South America, and then a lot of Europe. So there's a lot of room for this species to grow and expand their range. And this is a big issue for a couple of reasons. And so I'll talk a little bit about what exactly they do that is an issue. So it's their feeding and that impact that becomes an issue when they come into an area. So they feed on at least 75 different species of plants. So like I said, their preferences are the tree of heaven. They also prefer grapevines. So you can imagine vineyards have a big stake in this investigation. And if you have ever, like I said, had the unlucky experience of having them in your area, you can find them on most trees. When they finally came to Philly, and part of my research was finding training aids in our yard, almost every tree you could find them on. And when I first started this, I thought that the main issue was them feeding on the trees. So actually like eating the trees. And they do, but the problem is that as they're eating that phlegm, they leave like a honeydew. And I have some pictures of what this looks like. But what happens is this phlegm depletion does cause the tree to weaken, but it's the honeydew that comes from these guys. So basically, the feces that causes this kind of sooty mold. It attracts other insects and affects photosynthesis. And this is a big problem because the trees basically slowly die. So in Philly, where we had these guys, if you ever are there, if you see them in your area, basically all the trees start to just look black and they get really sticky. And I have a couple of pictures of that as well. So in terms of their impact, these are a couple of years old investigations. I'm sure it's much more than this by now, but at the time in Pennsylvania, it was estimated that their agriculture impact was 99 million in agriculture, and 236 million in forestry. And so this was kind of where it started, where the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture reached out to our group at the Working Dog Center to see if we could maybe use dogs to look into these guys. Vineyards are, of course, particularly vulnerable. Of course, they're really common in the Northeast. Now that I'm in New York, there have been a lot of discussions about it for the vineyards, and especially because they have a preference for grapevines. Um, and obviously, since the spread of spotted lanternflies, since these assessments, it's likely that the actual economic impacts are a lot higher, right? So this is just Pennsylvania, not the other 17 states that it's in. And just for some pictures of what it looks like, for those of you guys who have maybe not see it, this is from one of the colleges posted this. So on the left here, you can see the trunk is weeping from its phlegm getting eaten. On the top right, you can see this blackening of the tree. So this is that sooty mold that we're talking about that grows on that secretion. And then on the bottom here, you see a fermentation of those sugars and the honeydew. And so you can imagine the problems this causes for the trees. And I will say, when we had our first invasion of spotted lanternflies at Penn, most of the trees had kind of this amount of spotted lanternflies, not this. It was a lot. Here you can also see a couple of pictures. So this was when the photographer went out to take a picture of the trees, and you can see that sugary response at the bottom, and then that went away, but the sooty mold stays on the trees, and so this is a big issue for them. Most of what I was working with was tree egg masses, not vines or vineyards. Not that it's different, just most of what we were looking at in Philly was on trees. And so the opportunity kind of came up that maybe we can use detection dogs to investigate and sort of stop the spread of these guys outside of their quarantine zone. Those of you who maybe don't know, dogs are already used in so many areas of wildlife detection. On the right here is a picture of Kayla from Canine Conservationists and one of her dogs. They've been working in Alaska looking at finding wolf scat. Similar to working maybe in vineyards, they were used and are used to find citrus greening disease in fruits before it can be seen visually. But the biggest hurdle that we had when we were kind of conceptualizing this, and I say we as in the Working Dog Center, though a lot of groups were working on spotted lanternfly detection dogs at the same time, was a lack of training egg. So a couple of issues there. Eggs are a lack of training aids, sorry. So eggs are only found at certain times of the year, like I said, so they overwinter, but then the rest of the year you don't have eggs available. And then if I decide to train my dogs on dead eggs, so I devitalize them and I use them as training aids for the year when there aren't live ones available. Would my dogs find live ones? This was also a question for us because when we first started this project, spotted lanternflies weren't in Philly. And so one of the first questions we had was, how would we even do this test? Because of course nobody wanted to give us spotted lanternflies, live spotted lanternflies outside of the quarantine zone. So that was a big question. There was even a moment of, will Jenny take care of a spotted lanternfly colony in the lab? And nope, definitely outside of my wheelhouse. And if dogs don't find dead eggs, if I can't use dead eggs for training, how can I use live eggs while avoiding accidental spread? So there are a lot of questions coming when we first started this. And we first started the project at Penn with 3 dogs. So on the left is Toby. He's a small Munsterlander. He is the one I am desperately feeding and is coughing during this presentation right next to me. In the middle is Pacey. She was actually a human remains detection dog who kind of moonlighted in some research studies. And on the right is Grizzly. He was a German Shepherd owned by one of the trainers at Penn who offered to be on the study. So our first aim was to find a training aid. So like I said, can you train dogs on, can dogs even recognize the odor of spotted lanternfly compared to background odors like trees? And I say that with can they, thinking, of course they can. Dogs have never not been able to find anything, at least in our lab. So can they find them? Can they distinguish it from bark, leaves, background odor, right? Because they're not just needing to find eggs. They're needing to find eggs in reality where there are lots of different background odors. And if we could train them on these dead eggs, can they find from that training, can they find live egg masses? Or can we use those dead egg masses as a training aid? And will the dog spontaneously or fairly quickly transfer to live eggs? And like I said, when we started this project, spotted lanternflies weren't in Philly, so there was no opportunity for us to start with live eggs. So it worked for us that this was our question anyway. And so what we started with was eggs that had been frozen in a -80 Celsius freezer for 96 hours. This was to ensure the eggs were dead, so they were given to us by another lab through Pennsylvania. They were also heat treated, and this was important so that they didn't mold in the fridge. We kept them in mason jars in the refrigerator, just a normal refrigerator when they weren't being used. Again, trying to avoid any mold and have them last as long as possible. And we trained dogs on both scraped eggs, which is what you see on the left here, and egg masses on bark, which is what you see on the right here. So this is an egg mass in the middle. You can almost see like the little dots between it. And of course, this one has a lot of background odor with that bark it's on. And so not only did they have to find those, they had to ignore all relevant things. So some examples of things they had to learn to ignore, obviously the bark. We are very lucky that the people that we were working with that originally gave us those egg masses also took a sample from the exact same tree bark to use as direct controls for those egg masses. And then we kept controls of other things. So different types of cardboard that it was shipped in, the scrapers that were given away, typical things like gloves, tape, anything that we thought might have come in contact with these spotted lanternfly eggs that we were getting and using in the lab. And I have a video here of the 3 dogs. And so I will say when we first were presenting this to the dogs, and you'll see here, we kind of were worried they weren't going to be able to do it. The odor is as we thought, it was really faint for them. Most of our dogs hadn't yet worked on something so low. And so what you see here is a scent wheel. Each of these little arms can hold a different container. So you see here 3 containers, and each of these containers is one of those mason jars. So we just opened up the lid and put it in. The first dog that goes is Grizzly, and then Pacey, and then Toby. And what they're supposed to do is stop at their target odor and either sit or stare. And you'll see the first 2 dogs don't seem to recognize, and then the 3rd dog does, which is where we kind of were like, yeah, maybe this can work, and let's keep going. And yes, they will search even if there's not a port there. Sometimes it's a bit of a habit. And so this was us really trying to, what we're doing was click on sniff. So any of you guys in the nosework community, we're just kind of imprinting the dog and showing them that odor gets them a reward. And that's Pacey. You'll see she's very fast. Human remains detection, much smellier than spotted lanternflies. Her biggest issue in the study was slowing down. And so that's Toby. He was kind of the first dog to really get the target odor. I was super proud because he was my foster and he was the dog I was handling. So from there, was really where we were kind of like, yeah, we can move forward with this project. It seems like there's something there. And so even though the dogs struggled initially, they were able to learn that target odor. And they were able to learn to detect that dead spotted lanternfly, even with ignoring multiple background odors. So, like I said, we had lots of different tree barks, and other living things in that background, to make sure they were really honing in on those dead spotted lanternfly egg masses. Uh, our second part, of course, was to see if they would then transfer to live egg masses. So we presented the dogs with live egg masses, scraped eggs, you see on the right here, and egg masses taken freshly from outside, because by the time we got to this point, the eggs, spotted lanternfly had come much closer to or in Philly, so we could just actually go and grab them. And we used double blind testing. So nobody in the room knew if or where the masses were. And so there was no chance that we could incidentally bias the dogs, which of course, again, like any of you guys that work with dogs in detection, very, very common. And so what we found was, and I have a couple of graphs here of how the dogs did. So this is Grizzly. On the bottom, you can see the number of sessions, typically 5 to 10 trials in a session. The blue dark line here is their sensitivity. So this is how well they detect their target odor. So are they hitting their spotted lanternfly eggs? And the orange here is specificity. So how well they're ignoring non-target odors. So as you can see, it took about 10 sessions before he was pretty consistently above 90%. And so after those sessions, we presented him with the live egg masses, and he pretty much immediately spontaneously transferred to those live egg masses over the course of maybe 10 sessions. With Pacey, like I said, she was a little bit more all over the place. Her sensitivity trended a little bit lower, but she searched the wheel so very fast. As a search and rescue dog, this was her calling, or this was not her calling for sure, but she still did okay. And then she ended up trending towards the better end once we swapped her to live egg masses. And then Toby was very similar. So he transferred from those dead egg masses to live egg masses very quickly. So we were very happy about this. This allowed us to, the paper we have published basically talks about, dead egg masses being a training aid, especially for individuals who aren't able to keep and shouldn't keep live egg masses around. So all the dogs were able to quickly recognize and transfer to live egg masses after we trained them on dead egg masses, which was great. Dogs can do this in the lab, but once spotted lanternfly are in the lab, we know they're there. So this is not really what we need the dogs to do, right? We need them to be able to do this in the real world. And I have a video of some of the things we did, though the not fun thing about this was we were right in this when COVID happened. And so we weren't able to continue beyond this. So I'll talk about a couple of studies that have. But here's a video of a few of the things that we were doing prior to COVID sending us home, unfortunately. And so this was some of the first times we ever took them outside to work. And all of these dogs had experience with searching odors outside. So we trained them all on UGC, which is just a generic training aid odor. So we didn't have to train them to work outside, but they had never searched for spotted lanternfly eggs outside. One of the things that we found that was really difficult, and those of you in the nose work community, you can see Pacey not made for calm detection scenarios, is they were not as good at transferring to hides that weren't clearly hides, so to speak, right? So if you see spotted lanternfly on a tree. It's just kind of out in the open on a tree. It's not in a hide. So if we put, a spotted lanternfly eggs just like on the ground or on the side of a car, but not say under car door handle, they struggled more, right? Obviously less odor is being contained, but just in general, dogs also have a tendency to look for hides if that's how they've been trained. Um, and so that was one of the things that we were working on before COVID sent us home, working on more open hides versus things, hides in things, so to speak. Um, So like I said, that was kind of where at the Working Dog Center our investigation ended, largely because of COVID and because we had done our job of can this work for the Department of Agriculture. But there have certainly been other findings, and some of this happened at the same time as what we were doing. There were, like I said, a lot of labs working on the same thing. So Nathan Hall's lab at Texas Tech, the Canine Olfaction Lab, continued and had a few studies on SLF detection dogs. So one study found that they were able to find the eggs despite a whole bunch of background odors. That's one really important part, right? Because most of these eggs, they're not finding it in a lab setting. Of course, they also found that the threshold of finding these eggs increased as the addition of tree bark as a background odor. So they couldn't find it at as low of a threshold when there was a strong background odor of tree bark, which completely makes sense. There are negative effects of background noise when dogs are doing different tasks, but especially in this task. And this is a picture here of some olfactometers, which you can look up. They have a really cool paper out on these machines that can like push out the air for dogs, much more sophisticated than what we were doing with our little scent wheel, but very cool. Another study that was done kind of in the vein of the fact that even though we know that dogs are a really good tool for this study and this purpose, there are already way too few detection dogs in the US for any kind of thing. So if you look on any study on like explosives detection dogs, TSA, all these things, we don't have enough dogs for that. And so if you're going to genuinely use dogs for spotted lanternfly, one of the issues you'll have is the upfront cost of these dogs and the difficulty in finding them. And so Hannah Decker, Texas Tech, she did a study looking at the utilization of pet dogs to test their ability to be trained to detect these eggs. They were trained to search outside. They used cinder blocks and other relevant scenarios. So these are some pictures over here. And this was one of the first, at least to my knowledge, like published suggestions of the use of pet dogs, especially those that have been previously trained in nose work as kind of a community science scenario that could be used in the future. And probably a lot of you have heard of it. I know that I was told that some of the people on this call have worked on another study that's going on as a collaboration between Virginia Tech and Texas Tech with all of these authors you see here. And Sally Dickinson was kind enough to give me some information about this to present here. So they looked into using handler dog teams from Nosework Sports Community, and they also had some retired SAR, search and rescue handlers, basically looking at what Hannah Decker had looked at, but on a larger scale, can you use these teams in this way to search for spotted lanternflies, especially in areas where they're new in the area. There was a lot of enthusiasm from citizen scientists. So they had over 1,100 people expressing interest. And I will say that this was mass enthusiasm. There were a few nosework events I went to that when I told them some of my background, they were like, oh my gosh, I heard about this opportunity. How do I get in contact with them? Can you get me in contact with them? Yeah, just a huge amount of people, and they enrolled about 180 from the initial response. Of course, with any study, you have some attrition, but from those who stayed in the study, there was really strong evidence that this population of individuals and their companion dogs could learn to detect spotted lanternfly eggs. And I will say from my current position, I've been involved in a lot of nose work events just because sometimes we host them on campus, and those dogs are excellent. The handlers are excellent. So anyone from the nosework field is probably, or nosework sports community is probably not surprised to hear this, but it is very cool nonetheless. And what they did was they trained the dogs on those dead or devitalized eggs and tested whether they would spontaneously generalize to live egg masses. So not exactly like what we did, but very similar. And they found that about 70% of those who attempted that field evaluation passed with precision over 80%, which is very good. And of course, look out for the paper. I think Sally said that they have 2 papers almost done in the works. And yeah, that'll be really exciting because I do think, community science for these sorts of things is really where a lot of this is going. One of the other things to discuss is, humans can see spotted lanternfly eggs. So what benefit do dogs bring us beyond just humans going out and finding them ourselves? So there was a study that was very recently published by Fuller, a few of the collaborations at, I think, Cornell and a couple of the conservation groups up in the Northeast. They actually compared detection dogs and humans looking for spotted lanternfly eggs in vineyards versus forested areas. Humans did outperform dogs in vineyards, but dogs outperformed humans in the forested areas. And one of the reasons why this is probably the case, and they discussed it in the paper, was that dogs are really valuable in areas where humans can't work as well. So if you can imagine looking for these tiny little brown egg masses in a forest where there's underbrush and tons of leaves and dense forests, dense trees, dogs are much better at that. Dogs are also really good in general with being able to find odors amongst background odors. And so it's not surprising that this would be, a complex environment where humans are less able to utilize their vision, and dogs can really kind of swoop in and supplement us in those areas. And in the study, they had really mostly focused on moderate to high infestation areas. And there is a lot of room for, dogs would probably also still be better in scenarios that are low infestation. So if there's less for us to see, they might, work in areas where humans are, again, not as good. And I will say that is a massive quick overview of that paper. It even talks about dogs doing better or worse in different winds and things like that. It's a very, very good paper on the concept of and potential future application of spotted lanternfly detection dogs. And it is open access, so anyone who wants to read it can. Though I will say anything here that's not open access, I know the authors will send it to you if you just email them. For us at Penn, when that study ended, the Department of the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture had the Working Dog Center train the first spotted lanternfly detection dog for them. So Canine Lucky, she's a German Shepherd dog. And based on the info that we had from our study, we trained her to actually go and work out in the field. We didn't train her exactly like we had trained the dogs in the lab, of course, because her purpose was a bit different. But from what we had learned there, we could really help the trainers and let them know here, here's the controls they struggled with. Here's how you safely transport eggs, just lots of different things. And Lucky still works for the Department of Agriculture. And actually, they just got their second dog from the Working Dog Center, Canine Ruby. And in preparation for this talk, I actually reached out to Shane and Shelby just to ask a few questions on kind of how they're like where they work, what they do. because some people tend to think that we use dogs to like eradicate the eggs, or go into areas and get rid of these spotted lanternflies. But most of what they do is actually kind of in business settings that work with the Department of Agriculture, to help them prevent shipping these eggs to places they don't exist. So the implementation of the dogs is really on making sure these items don't get outside of the quarantine zone as much as possible, because like I said, most of the movement of, or big movement of these this species is human movement of these eggs. It probably doesn't look like it anymore, but especially back when it first started, you could kind of track, you could, if you looked on a map of where the eggs were spreading, it was along like railroads, so really like where humans were taking them. um they train on both scraped eggs and frozen eggs, but they actually imprint the dogs on whole unfrozen egg masses. So Ruby was just imprinted and trained this past spring, so she'll be about a year on spotted lanternfly, and they trained her on whole unfrozen egg masses because that's what they've found has been the easiest. um the most difficult scenarios they have are searching trees, which is interesting that even though dogs are best on searching trees compared to humans, better at searching trees compared to humans, it's still very difficult. Shane said one of the things they found the most difficult was because trees had the least handler or human scent compared to like vehicles or other products. And so it actually made them have to be more careful about their training scenarios to make sure the dogs were really focusing on what they wanted them to. And I asked also if they had any plans, just out of curiosity, to train the dogs on nymphs or adults or anything like that. They said no, but they have added the box tree moth to the repertoire of odors. So the Department of Ag has started using these dogs not just for spotted lanternflies, but for another species, which is very cool. And they're working on approval for more dogs. And he did mention that North Carolina has 2 spotted lanternfly detection dogs as well. I'm not knowledgeable on which other states do. But I think, as this information gets out, there's no reason to think that, potentially they keep expanding. Um, so there's some pictures of Lucky and Ruby. As you can see, they're not like out working in the forest. They're really more working in lumber yards, nurseries, places that are planning to transport these eggs in different scenarios, really to keep that quarantine zone a true quarantine zone and not let as many eggs as possible out. So say you don't have a dog and you just watched this whole presentation on how we can use dogs to help in this. What can you do? Or if you have a dog, what should you do? So you should report spotted lanternfly spottings. And this is especially true if you're in areas where you don't think spotted lanternfly have been found. I will say that for me, this has happened twice. So I reported it when they came over to New Jersey when I lived there. And also now that I'm in New York, they're like very slowly getting towards Cobleskill. But it's really important that the states know, where these guys are being found. It's still best practice to destroy them. So if you find the bugs, yes, they're pretty and yes, they're big. And so it's a little bit gross, but kill them. Scrape the eggs. If you go into an area that the spotted lanternfly have been for a while, you will never kill all the eggs. But if you have the chance to kill some, like I said, every egg mass is 50 to 60 little eggs. And so it is helpful. Another thing that can help, especially if you have like a property with trees, you can trap them on trees, but be careful because it is very easy to make traps that also trap other animals. So there is a really nice how-to by Penn State at this link that I know you can't click because it's a presentation, but if you look it up, you can find it on how to make this. Because if you look it up, and I found this picture on actually a website that was, I think, like a pest control website, like how do I keep spotted lanternfly eggs out of my my yard. And this was a picture they gave, and as you probably can imagine, that is sticky tape. And it does catch the spotted lanternflies because they crawl up the tree, but it also catches anything that gets onto sticky traps. So this is going to be a no. But these are some pictures of other ways you can have a sticky trap, but not catch other items. So unfortunately, if you look some of the far left ones up, you'll see like snakes caught, birds, really unfortunate things that you don't want to be catching in them. And so, you know, there is stuff you can do, but unfortunately, once spotted lanternflies are in an area, they become prolific really quickly, and so do what you can. But the biggest impact is going to be not spreading them. And so, for example, when we first had them in Philly, one of the things that the department said to us was, check your card before you leave the area. Make sure you're not transporting like wood or anything that could be, moving these eggs out. And it is really easy to overlook them. I'll end quickly with my current work. So if anyone's interested in continuing to talk about different types of conservation detection, like Renee said, I work on round goby detection, which is an invasive fish in the river, well, in a couple of places in the Great Lakes, and now it's in a local river to us. So we're looking at whether dogs can be used to detect this alongside some other methods. So if you're in New York or any area nearer to me and you want to collaborate, we'll probably end up moving this to a community science scenario as well, just to get more dogs. Here's my references page. I could have referenced 3 times as many of these, but if you see a number in any of the presentation, it's tied to these. And like I said, a lot of these are open access. If they're not, I'm sure the authors would be happy to share with you their work. And then, like I said, all of this work, the spotted lanternfly work was done at the Working Dog Center. And so huge efforts there to work through all this. Of course, my current job that allows me to continue this work and still give presentations on past work. Shelby Wise took almost all those really nice fancy pictures, and then unfortunately lost Canine Pacey and Canine Grizzly in the past couple of years. But they were 2/3 of the project, so I don't want to leave them out. And you've heard from Toby for the last 45 minutes. And then I guess I'll take questions now. And if anyone wants to contact me later, there's all of my socials and my email. I'm happy to take questions now, or if you wake up in the middle of the night later and you're like, I wish I had asked this question, feel free to shoot me an email or add me on something.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for sharing all that with us. This is eye-opening for me because I don't really know much about using dogs as detectors. So
Yeah.
I appreciate it. So there are some questions. If they're too entomology-like, then we'll just move on. But I don't think they will be for you.
Okay.
If the eggs are laid on something other than a tree, when they hatch, do they travel to a tree or vine to begin feeding?
Yes. So
Oh,
they won't like try to feed on like a car or something. They
right.
they go to trees to feed on. Yep. Yeah. So
Okay.
most of the eggs we found that weren't on trees were near trees. So if they were on like cars, they were near trees, or the pallets, they were near trees. They weren't like leaving the trees to find pallets, so to speak.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, do cold temperatures limit their spread?
We never had a scenario like can it get cold enough to kill the eggs, I guess,
Yes, I
is
think that's the question. Yeah.
we didn't have that as an issue ever, and it never
Okay.
came up that was ever gonna like I said, we had to freeze it really low for a number of days before the state was like, okay, we trust these are dead, like
Okay.
negative, negative 80 Celsius.
Okay. Um, Here's a question about the dogs. Obviously, the detection option is new, but are there any indication of one breed being better than another?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up all the time, every time I talk about detection. So you're in good company here. Um, at the Working Dog Center, we did trend towards the typical dogs you would think of, so German Shepherds, um, Dutch Shepherds, Labrador Retrievers. Part of it is because they've gone through so much selection to be working dogs.
Mhm.
And uh part of it is they have that work ethic. That is to say, if you're talking about olfaction in general, Probably most dogs can do it. And I think, once the study comes out with those like 180 or so teams, I think you'll find a really wide range of dog breeds, and it really comes more down to dog personality than
Okay.
breeds. And some breeds just have a higher rate of those personalities that you're
I
looking
gotcha.
for.
That makes sense. Sure. We won't call out any breeds on this.
No, no.
We're
I
not
mean,
judging any breeds.
Toby is a small Munsterlander. He's a weird breed, and he does great, but he could
No, that's
never go out and work like, at an airport or something because of his personality.
okay, gotcha. There's quite a few questions about if the dogs have the ability to detect the eggs when they're high up in trees. So is there a distance that the eggs need to be for them to detect them?
That is a great question, and the answer is yes. Um, like I said, we kind of got cut off by COVID, but I will say anecdotally, when we started working on it, it was a real issue to get them onto higher up trees. And, part of that is just the ways odor moves, and the fact that these eggs are, on a tree and there's nothing kind of containing that odor, it goes everywhere. We
Okay.
also had the issue with once the spotted lanternfly were in our area, there were so many egg masses that the dogs were almost getting overwhelmed and unable to pinpoint an egg mass. So I do
Oh,
think there needs to be, and there will be for sure, more research into those areas where there are less eggs or fewer eggs, how well
mhm.
the dogs do at it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so then I believe the answer is if the egg masses are high up in trees, they really can't determine which tree they're in. Is that what
I
you
think
said?
I don't know if there's any research on it, but just from
Okay.
my experience with the dogs, I think that would be very difficult.
Okay. Gotcha. Gotcha. Um, oh, can you retrain them to detect other pests, or is it one pest for a long period of time?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason that if you were okay with your dog finding a pest and then you secondarily confirming which pest,
Hmm.
that would be okay. I'll give you an example of if I had my dog on explosives and drugs, I don't want that because I don't want my dog alerting on something that could mean, there's marijuana here or there's a bomb here because the responses are very different. But if my
Yeah.
response was, I don't want either of these species here, and so I need to collect this sample and destroy it, that's okay. And like I said, Shane and Shelby uh, are both training the dogs, cross training them on different odors,
Hmm.
different insects, and so I think that's okay as long as you have considerations for what that means in reality. Yeah.
Um, approximately how long does it take to train a dog to be productive? So how much time did you spend with them?
So I think on this study, it's a bit difficult, and you probably have the same kind of confound with the nosework dogs, and that all of these dogs had already been trained to search for odor. So they were trained on what's called UDC, which is a synthetic odor not found in the environment. So they already knew how to search the scent wheel. They already knew how to search for odor, and so all we had to do to them was add odor. Um, that said, just again, anecdotally at the Working Dog Center, dogs could be pretty proficient. They started at 8 weeks, 7, 9 months, they're pretty good. And then same thing with that, the other study with all the nosework teams, all those dogs are already trained to find odor. You're just adding a second odor to their repertoire. And
Mhm.
so the amount of time it takes a dog to get the mechanics of searching can vary a lot per dog, but typically adding additional odors is doesn't take that long.
Okay, excellent. Oh, are the dogs cross-trained to other scents? You mentioned cadaver scent versus spotted lanternfly eggs.
Yeah, so Toby wasn't, Grizzly also wasn't, though they were both used for COVID actually later. This got caught off by COVID and we kind of pivoted those dogs to COVID. Pacey was a FEMA certified human remains detection dog. Normally we don't cross train them because again, same thing. I don't want my dog barking at spotted lanternfly when they should be finding human remains, but we figured the chances of that because the amount of odor on the eggs was really low, and she was, I don't want to say close to retiring, but she was older.
Mhm.
And her handler was okay with the cross training. But no, typically we didn't cross train the dogs unless we were completely sure that there would be no issues with that cross training.
I gotcha. I gotcha. And is this a similar type of training that is done whenever dogs are trained to find truffles?
I can't say I'm an expert on truffle detection dogs. Anytime you have something buried, that's like something else you have to
Ah,
add. So when we
interesting.
are
Yeah.
training, yeah, when we're training the dogs to do detection, just like with the UDC at the center, you do have to take careful to train them on buried or low hides and ceiling hides and anything. Humans tend to put hides like, 2 to 5 feet because that's where we're biased at. And so dogs will start to bias themselves against buried hides or ceiling hides. And anyone who's done nose work knows, in at least AKC, maybe the same in NACSW,
Hmm.
buried hides is actually a different like ribbon and group. So it is
I
actually
gotcha.
something that gets trained separately because it is it's still
Yeah,
detection, but it is a potentially different behavior. Yeah.
for sure. For sure. I didn't even think about the buried nature of it. Um,
Yeah.
do you know if eggs are detected in a vineyard, are the eggs simply removed or is the whole plant destroyed?
That's a good question. I guess I'm probably not knowledgeable enough to say
Okay.
that, though I will say eggs, being scraped from something doesn't leave anything that it from
Is
my
harmful.
knowledge,
Hmm.
right? Like once
Yeah,
the eggs are gone and scraped, unless there's some other reason, I think it would be okay. That said, if you find one egg mass, there's probably a lot of egg masses, but I don't know if the solution is eradication of the whole vineyard or not. Probably
right.
not. But also just I'm thinking of like how long it would take to get rid of all these egg masses. I honestly, yeah,
I
that's a little
know.
outside of my expertise. That's a great question though.
Can you give any suggestions where if someone is interested in training their dog to this, how can they learn how to get into this work?
Oh, that's a tough one. Like I said, because
Okay.
the biggest one was the study with that was the collaboration between Texas Tech and Virginia Tech that Sally Dickinson was running. And I would imagine with their paper, they're gonna be discussing next steps for how this can be rolled out beyond just a research way. I if there's a local college that you have, like I said, if anyone is near me, I'm getting into the conservation stuff now at my school.
Sure.
Cornell does some, obviously Virginia and Texas Tech, though I asked before this if they're enrolling anyone else, and they're like, no, 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 we have so many. So
I gotcha.
I don't know. Hopefully it becomes like a thing that people can get involved in. Yeah.
Um, there are a handful of questions about like when you do find one. I mean, obviously it's pretty obvious how you kill the adults. Basically just step on them, and they're gone. But when you say scraping the egg masses, what actually do you physically need to do to the egg masses to destroy them?
So you can smash them. So
Okay.
you can literally
Okay.
smash them.
Hmm.
And I don't know if this is still best practice. I can see in the chat some people are saying like they don't want you to put sticky traps up anymore. And that, all those best practices, maybe
Hmm.
they changed. This was just information for me asking the handlers. So I forgive me if that was wrong now.
It's okay.
Or you can scrape it into like alcohol, but most people don't carry around jars of alcohol like I was when I was
Right.
collecting these egg masses. So smushing them is perfectly sufficient, or just
Yeah.
scraping them off of the tree will often do it. If you
Sounds
try and
great.
scrape them, they kind of smush.
Well, I just want to let everyone know that there were a couple questions about the Fuller study. So when I send a follow-up email tomorrow, I'll include a link to that study. So if people want to read it and learn more about that particular study, you will have the opportunity to. And I think with this, I think we're going to wrap up, Jennifer. I
Yeah,
totally appreciate you sharing what your work is with the dogs. It's exciting, and thank you.
yeah, no problem. The study that we have from mine is open access, so you
Okay.
shouldn't have to like pay to get it. But if anyone, wants to reach out,
Sounds good.
I'm happy to. My email on that email is probably my pen one. Doesn't work anymore. So only my
Are you gonna
Cobleskill one works.
are you gonna show us your dogs before you go?
Oh yeah, I should. Toby, come here, bud. All right, let me unblur. Come here. So this is the professional spotted lanternfly
Oh,
sniffer slash cougher during presentation.
that's the sniffer and the
That's the sniffer.
cougher all in
Yeah,
one.
spotted lanternfly and COVID detection dog. Who knew?
Hi,
So
Toby. He's a cutie.
yes.
Uh, well, thank you again, Jennifer. I'm
Yeah.
going to stick around and let people put things in the chat. And if we didn't get to your question and you're still on here, we'll answer it tomorrow offline. Sound good?
Yep. Or
Okay,
contact me if you need. Thanks,
sounds good.
guys.
Thanks, Jennifer.